Hello and welcome. You're listening to Rogue Resistance, a podcast in support of ORD2 Indivisible. I'm your host, Rhonda Nowak. Fellow Oregonians, I want to tell you in no uncertain terms, we are living through an authoritarian takeover of American democracy. It's not teetering on the edge, it's not at risk. Authoritarian governance is happening right now, and corruption is its weapon of choice. For this episode, I'm launching a new segment called Rogue Reads, where I crack open a selection of important books that help us understand the shitstorm swirling around us. Today, I'm discussing Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum's insightful book, Autocracy, Inc. She shows us that autocracy feeds on corruption and loyalty networks, a pattern we also see in local historian and author Jeffrey LaLande's book, The Jackson County Rebellion. Jeff tells the little-known but fascinating story of political corruption right here in the Rogue Valley during the 1930s, an era when demagogues exploited lies about government graft to seize power, and the public found itself caught between propaganda and reality. Sound familiar? So let's begin by shedding light on the word corruption. It comes from the Latin corrumpere, meaning to break apart or spoil. Originally, it referred to literal decay as in rotting or corrupted flesh. Today, it usually means political decay, rotten leaders breaking laws, norms, and public trust to serve themselves and their associates. Applebaum's main point in her book is that modern autocracies work through networks of loyalty, greed, and disinformation that cross national borders. Trump isn't just influenced by this autocratic network, he's a part of it, and he doesn't try to hide it. He openly idolizes Putin, courts Viktor Orban, and praises Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He just slapped Brazil with 40% tariffs, which Americans will end up paying with coffee prices, and he did this because his ally, former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, was arrested for attempting to steal the election in 2022. Trump's authoritarian regime isn't an American aberration. It's an American franchise of Autocracy, Inc. I've taken creative liberty to turn Applebaum's conceptual framework into a monster called authoritarian corruption. Any resemblance to a real person is entirely coincidental, of course. This orange-faced fiend with a comb-over has 6 appendages, and another teeny tiny one if you look really hard. Appendage number 1 is kleptocracy, 2, abuse of power, 3, election fraud and voter suppression, 4, peddling influence and trading favors, 5, nepotism and cronyism, and 6, constitutional subversion. Together, these 6 arms of the authoritarian corruption monster are strangling American democracy. Let's break it down. In the last episode of Rogue Resistance, I focused on kleptocracy. I showed how Trump uses public office as his personal ATM. Secret Service stays at Mar-a-Lago, foreign dignitaries funneling money through his hotels, selling all kinds of merch, shaping economic policy to benefit his family's Bitcoin venture. The list goes on and on. Trump's branch of Autocracy, Inc. is organized theft dressed up as governance. But that's only one arm of the authoritarian corruption monster. The second arm is abuse of power, otherwise known as Trump's favorite pastime. Applebaum could have written this chapter about Putin's Russia, except I bet Putin's jealous of how brazenly Trump abuses his power. For instance, Trump's DOJ has made no bones over its firing of over 40 career prosecutors, the people who investigate public corruption, election crimes, civil rights violations, and white-collar fraud. You know, the boring folks who keep democracy from collapsing. They're gone. Why? Because loyalty trumps the law every single time in Trump's authoritarian playbook. And he hasn't stopped there. Trump's axed 200 more staffers across the DOJ, including attorneys in fraud and corruption units. He's gutted the public integrity section, the division literally designed to police corrupt officials, down to 5 lawyers. That's a perfect number if you never plan to investigate anything. And remember inspectors general, the watchdogs who sniff out waste and abuse across federal agencies? Trump fired 17 of them in one night. Oversight of this administration isn't just dead, it's buried without a headstone. Meanwhile, DOJ attorneys are resigning in protest after being ordered to drop corruption charges against Trump allies. One called it the new Saturday Night Massacre. Personally, I think that's insulting to Nixon. At least he had the decency to look sneaky while he did it. Folks, what we have here is a hostile takeover of the justice system. And spoiler alert, the DOJ isn't fighting back. And just to put a bow on it, Trump's DOJ is now reinvestigating James Comey, the former FBI director he fired for refusing a loyalty pledge, and John Brennan, Obama's CIA director who called out Trump's ties to Russia, and James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence who publicly warned about Russian election interference. Even more recently, Trump fired 3 senior FBI officials who were deemed insufficiently loyal. He also fired the chief commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the disappointing jobs report that she released to the public in July. With only hand-picked loyalists left in charge, Americans can now rest easy knowing every official fact from our government will be about as trustworthy as a campaign promise. The third arm of corruption that Applebaum talks about in Autocracy, Inc. is nepotism and cronyism. Americans have certainly watched as Trump has surrounded himself with family and friends who couldn't pass a basic civics test. Forget resumes. Trump hires like it's a loyalty rewards program, all while claiming he's draining the swamp and prioritizing merit in the federal government. Right. Hungary's authoritarian leader Viktor Orban filled his government with party hacks. Americans' authoritarian leader does it with family members, golf buddies, and lots of Fox newscasters. The result's the same, though. Democratic institutions have become private businesses run by Trump's family and friends. Trump rewards his cronies like it's Black Friday. Kash Patel was handed the FBI director job, and Linda McMahon got education secretary. Both received massive stock packages worth more than $779,000 each, even though their main resume bullet is, "I'm loyal to Trump." Meanwhile, Emil Bove, Trump's personal lawyer turned fixer at the DOJ, was just confirmed to the Third Circuit bench for life, even after saying the DOJ would need to consider telling the courts "fuck you" to orders blocking the deportation of undocumented immigrants. Bove's confirmation by the Republican-held Senate represents the beginning of a MAGA judiciary. Let that sink in. Applebaum spells all this out in Autocracy, Inc. Autocrats don't want experts. They want people who owe them, need them, and never say no. Who needs competence when you've got obedience? The fourth arm of corruption is election fraud and voter suppression. Rig the game so you never lose. In the last couple of months, as Trump's approval ratings have reached record lows, his DOJ has blasted out letters to 19 states demanding their voter rolls, election procedures, and ballot data. The DOJ's even pushed to inspect voting equipment. But let's be clear, this is not about voter security, it's about voter suffocation. Meanwhile, in Texas, Republican leaders backed by Trump are redrawing district maps to capture 5 more House seats, prompting Democrats to flee the state and threats of arrest from the Texas governor. The MAGA plan is to corrupt the election process by disenfranchising voters, primarily people of color. Apparently, democracy is now a coloring contest to see which Republican is best at drawing out of line. In Autocracy Inc., Applebaum warns that modern autocrats love elections. They just rewrite the rules until the ballots become mere stage props. From Hungary's gerrymanders to Russia's sham votes, it's all the same playbook, with Trump the lead actor in the American version. The fifth arm of corruption is peddling influence and trading favors. Trump's influence peddling looks less like policymaking and more like pay-to-play bingo. From receiving planes as illegal gifts from Qatar, as I discussed in episode 3, to dropping corruption cases for the likes of Eric Adams and dangling a Maxwell pardon like a get-out-of-jail card for sex traffickers who cooperate. Applebaum calls this transactional autocracy, where favors replace laws and loyalty is currency. Welcome to the Trump empire. Let's dig a little deeper into a few of these examples of trading favors. First, of course, is Elon Musk. Musk was handed the reins of Trump's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, where efficiency really meant slashing agencies and rolling back regulations, particularly those that padded Musk's own bottom line. And even after strutting out of the White House in May, the government checks keep rolling in for Elon. Multi-billion-dollar NASA and Space Force launches, Pentagon AI toys, defense satellites, and now Starlink beaming data for border surveillance. Public service has never been so profitable for some people. And then there's New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Trump's DOJ dropped federal corruption charges against Adams early in 2025 after a memo from Deputy Attorney General Emile Bove claiming prosecuting the mayor would prevent him from assisting federal officials in deporting immigrants. 7 DOJ attorneys resigned in protest, calling it a quid pro quo. And of course, we can't neglect to mention Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell met with Deputy AG Todd Blanche in July, reportedly offering information on 100-plus Epstein associates. The implication? Cooperate and maybe get a pardon, or at least a transfer to a cushy minimum security prison. Never mind the fact that sex offenders aren't even eligible to be there. There are many other examples of peddling influence and trading favors so far during Trump 2.0. High-dollar donors and loyalists regularly earn the right to make policy and federal employment pitches. Think Laura Loomer. They benefit from deregulation policies. Think the entire fossil fuel industry after Trump's energy czar, Doug Burgum, removed drilling restrictions on the National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And they receive pardons. Think of all those January 6th insurrectionists. These sketchy transactional relationships belong on a street corner rather than in the White House. Applebaum calls this the personal patronage racket of authoritarian regimes, and Trump's racket is definitely gold-plated. But folks, I have saved the most egregious arm of the authoritarian corruption monster for last, because this kind of corruption tears down the very framework on which our country was founded. The sixth arm of corruption is constitutional subversion. Back in Trump's first presidency, he openly called for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution, as if our founding document were an apprentice TV contract he could rip up mid-season. Now, in 2025, he's not just talking about shredding constitutional norms, he's doing it. Let's not forget that he has been greatly assisted by our corrupt Supreme Court and Republican members of Congress. Trump reinstated Schedule F, which allows him to purge the federal government of nonpartisan civil servants and replace them with political loyalists. This is a direct assault on the constitutional principle of checks and balances. Because without a politically independent civil service, the executive branch has now become Trump's personal fiefdom. Trump has ignored Supreme Court rulings, arrested his political opponents, and turned the Justice Department into a revenge squad. Equally disturbing is the way Trump treats Congress, not like a co-equal branch of government, but more like the audience at one of his rallies, there to clap, not to question. He's flat out ignored congressional appropriations by withholding disaster relief funds from states that don't toe the MAGA line, because apparently helping Americans after a natural disaster now requires political loyalty. When Congress allocated billions for climate initiatives and public health, Trump just shrugged and funneled the money into his ever-expanding border surveillance and immigrant deportation machine instead. Tariff hikes, military deployments, all done without congressional approval. And apparently, the Republicans in Congress think this is totally okay. Applebaum spells it out in Autocracy, Inc. Modern autocrats don't just violate their constitutions, they methodically dismantle them, clause by clause, until nothing's left but an authoritarian playbook written in Sharpie pen. This is the final piece of the autocratic puzzle. Constitutional subversion isn't just a side effect of corruption, it's the ultimate goal. Dismantle the safeguards, destroy checks and balances, and pave the way for unlimited, unaccountable power. So there it is, the six-armed monster of authoritarian corruption terrorizing our country. Kleptocracy? Check. Abuse of power? Check. Election fraud and voter suppression? Check. Peddling influence and trading favors? Check. Nepotism and cronyism? Check. And constitutional subversion? Check. Trump's regime has openly flaunted all of them. And don't forget, we're not even a year into his presidency yet. So, the question is, what do we do? Do we keep treating all this as politics as usual? Or do we call it what it is, organized corruption under an authoritarian regime? If you're listening to this podcast, you know where I stand. This isn't just about Trump, it's about the future of democracy. We already bought our ticket to Autocracy, Inc. in November, when 77 million Americans elected a convicted felon to lead our country. This may be just wishful thinking on my part, but I still cannot believe that most Americans want this for our country. So now we've got to beat back the monster. How? Well, we pay attention to what's going on, even through all of the distractions and all of the noise. We trust ourselves. That twinge in our gut, it's telling us this isn't normal. We're not okay. Our country is not okay. And we protest. We expose the corruption and we don't stop talking about it. We don't let the authoritarian corruption monster become the norm in American governance. And I wanted to suggest we read Applebaum's book, maybe twice, and we talk about it with other people, because in the age of Trump, truth is resistance. Autocracy, Inc. shows us how authoritarian leaders thrive on corruption, loyalty networks, transactional favors, and the hollowing out of constitutional law. And while Applebaum's talking about global power players like Trump and Putin, the same mechanics can play out right here at home. Which brings me to the Jackson County Rebellion. This book dives into our own Rogue Valley's brush with corruption in the 1930s, when local officials manipulated power, rewarded cronies, and intimidated anyone who challenged them. Sounds eerily familiar, right? What happened in Jackson County nearly a century ago isn't just dusty history. It's a warning flare that the same forces we see in Autocracy, Inc. can take root right in our own backyard. So I talked to Jeffrey LaLande, historian and author of the Jackson County Rebellion. Here's our conversation. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for talking with me today.
I'm pleased to be here, Rhonda.
Before we dive into the broader themes, I want to give listeners a sense of the story you tell in your book. In the early 1930s, a group in Jackson County calling themselves the Good Government Congress rose to power on a wave of anti-corruption rhetoric. But once in office, their leaders, orchardist and newspapermen L.A. Banks and Earl Fale, used that power for personal gain, suppressing opposition, stealing and destroying election ballots, and even inciting and perpetrating violence. It's a dramatic and disturbing chapter in Southern Oregon history. So, Jeff, what other highlights of the rebellion should be mentioned before we discuss connections to government corruption today?
Well, in my book, I go back in time to show how distinctively different Southern Oregon, especially Jackson County, was in its political and social outlook for many years, different than the rest of Oregon. The rebellion itself had roots in the earlier history of Southern Oregon. It's part of a tradition, what I call an ornery tradition here in southwestern part of the state.
What I found fascinating was that some of the contention between the people in the Rogue Valley came about because they came to Oregon from different places.
Yes, originally during the initial period of white settlement in southern Oregon, the majority of the settlers were from the lower Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, and the upper South. Both areas were heavily Southern in outlook, white supremacy, states' rights, small government, etc. And they kind of ruled the roost here, except there was a small smattering of New Englanders and New Yorkers and others in the Northeast who were largely merchants and ministers, but they're much smaller in number than they were upstate in the Willamette Valley, especially Portland and Salem. So things were definitely different here. But the big change in terms of people coming from different places arrived with the early 20th century during what's called the pear orchard boom, when the so-called orchard barons from back east, Chicago area especially, brought an entirely different social stratum to our region. And that was not without tensions between the old timers and, let's say, the much more sophisticated cosmopolitan elite, the orchard barons and all the professionals that came with them after 1905, basically, lawyers, merchants, and so forth. You have the usual tension between those two aspects, rural and urban, old and new, old timers and newcomers.
And then a lot of it seemed to have to do with the orchardists who were smaller in nature and were more individualistic and wanted to be more in control of the cash flow versus those who were more into the cooperative consignment types of marketing.
And those people that you mentioned lastly, they were part of a national system of commerce and somewhat progressive business practices.
Right. And so then you have these two orchardists slash newspaper men who come into the Rogue Valley and they are not happy with the urban elite. They're not happy with the way the orchardists are having to sell their produce. They're not happy with a lot of things. And so they are stirring the pot, so to speak, between the different tensions that have already been around for quite some time in the area.
Yeah, those tensions you just spoke of among orchardists especially really got going in the late 20s with various federal government practices and in rural America, let's call it the old agricultural establishment, felt threatened. The main instigator of the rebellion, there were two, Earl Fell, as you mentioned, who was a local contractor and had a weekly newspaper called the Pacific Record Herald, and Llewellyn A. Banks, who was a citrus grower from Southern California, Riverside County, who came up here in the late 20s and got into the pear orchard scene here and began overturning not so much the apple cart, but the pear cart of how things were done. And Banks owned a newspaper. He bought it in 1929, just a few weeks before the Wall Street crash that was the starting point of the Great Depression. Both of those newspapers were these two gentlemen's personal voices, their mouthpieces in Southern Oregon. And they used them going right up to and beyond the border of libel and slander.
So, Jeff, how did you come to write this book?
I've got to say, this topic earned my focused interest not long after I moved here to Southern Oregon in 1969, and I began looking into it. And eventually, in the early 1990s, decided I wanted to do my PhD dissertation up at U of O. I just couldn't believe the things that were being done during this time in little old Jackson County. Later, I finally got around to revising my dissertation to turn it into this book that was published a couple years ago by Oregon State University Press. I realized as I was revising my book that the story is so much what has become the story of the nation at large in recent years. In fact, in the end of the preface, I say some readers of this book may be struck, as I have been during the course of writing it, by the parallels between political events in Depression-era Southern Oregon and the divisive, turbulent national politics of the 21st century.
Absolutely. So let's get into those parallels. Jackson County's Good Government Congress was launched under the banner of anti corruption, yet it quickly descended into ballot theft, personal gain, and even violence. How does that transformation illustrate classic political corruption, where the rhetoric of reform becomes a tool for seizing power and oftentimes wealth?
Well, that rhetoric of reform that was voiced in their newspapers and during speeches and rallies on the Jackson County courthouse steps and Grange halls and schoolhouses throughout the county during the years of 1932-33. That rhetoric was very much, I believe, the selfish hopes of those two men, Banks and Fail. And it was a conscious put on job, although Banks would qualify as paranoid, psychotic. He was a brilliant, charismatic speaker, determined, self-certitude all the way. But he came up by his bootstraps. He was
Interesting.
from Northwestern Ohio. I think he was quite proud of his success, and he wanted to keep the orchard industry in the old way of getting paid cash for your crop rather than going on consignment and waiting for the middleman to pay you back, which could lead to good things or really bad things, depending on the market price that year. So he had various reasons to come up with this program of basically taking over the government of Jackson County.
I was struck by the same thing that you said about his personality. He had such a charismatic personality. It really does remind me a lot of Donald Trump because it ended up being a cult personality.
Yes, particularly in the rural parts of Jackson County, the people in those outlying communities, especially just outside of Medford, began to read only Banks and Fail's two newspapers. So they heard only what those two men wanted them to hear.
Mhm.
And some of them were refusing to even read the Medford Mail Tribune, which was published as the voice of order and rationality throughout this rebellious period. They thought it was corrupt and that the Tribune and its publisher, Robert Rule, were in cahoots with the people that so many hard-pressed residents of Southern Oregon, not just rural, but smaller business people in the cities and small orchardists near Medford were fearing that the Mail Tribune was part of this gang, as both Banks and Fail described what is essentially the county establishment. Every county, every town, every region has an establishment that pretty much runs things. And yeah, sometimes they can be a little hard on the little guy, for sure, especially when Debts are not being paid, when mortgages are being foreclosed upon because people aren't paying their debts and people are out of work. Banks were failing all over the country daily during this same period. Now, to me, this calls forth the events of the very recent past between MAGA and the parallel with the Good Government Congress, the GGC. The bank's fail operation during the rebellion really did become cult-like. And they had blindly loyal followers, followers who, even after the whole thing blew up, after Llewellyn Banks murdered a police officer sent to arrest him, and as a lot of other former members of the Good Government Congress left the organization after the killing, well, even while Banks was on trial and the other Good Government Congress defendants for the ballot theft were on trial for their part in those crimes, there were still a lot of people that remained loyal to Banks and Fail and thought they were a godsend.
Right. Now, that Good Government Congress was established because they were sure that the urban elites and the business elites of Medford and the Rogue Valley were corrupt. Was there any evidence that their claims had any credence at all?
I found no evidence of some diabolical plots or massive corruption, which Banks and Fail were continually talking about, like Donald Trump did the swamp.
Thought about that too. It was so interesting that they were so adamant that this gang was corrupt, and then they ended up engaging in corruption themselves, used media, as you said, their own newspapers, to amplify corruption claims and build their power.
Yes, the Banks and Fail newspapers were continually charging corruption and nefarious designs upon various portions of local law enforcement and lawyers and merchants and so forth, whereas the Tribune steadily took a calm and rational, let's be calm, people. So many people didn't read that. They were just continually inflamed. And they would go to these rallies to become even more inflamed by the speakers like Banks and Earl Fail. The difference between the 1930s Jackson County Rebellion and today, I think, is that the culture war has become so important today. Mm-hmm. That has been the way to inflame and incite anger, resentment, fear in all the old nasty ways. And it really wasn't so much a part of what Banks and Fail were doing. And I think mainly the reason for that is it was during the Great Depression, and economic dysfunction was foremost in everybody's minds. Whereas in recent years, things haven't been all that great for many of us, but it hasn't been another Great Depression. Right. And so we've had the luxury of getting inflamed about immigrants, sexual mores, and all that. That was not the case back in the 1930s.
I think that is an excellent point and is a very important distinction. When Banks and Fail took power, they attempted to capture county institutions and block oversight. What institutional breakdowns in Jackson County during that time mirror our current national situation?
Well, perhaps there are some aspects that mirror it, but what stands out to me is that fortunately there were two of the three county commissioners that were not part of this Good Government Congress movement and stood fast against it, despite threats of physical violence. Robert Rule drove his daughter to the private school she went to, the Catholic school in Medford. And he was not a Catholic, by the way, he was a Unitarian. But because the Rules were fearful of kidnapping of their daughter, things were so intense. The county commission and the judiciary fulfilled its role here. It did. The circuit court judge and others fulfilled their role, and they were not part and parcel of the Good Government Congress movement, this populist uprising led by Llewellyn Banks and Earl Thale. So that was a saving grace, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I kept thinking when I was reading the book how important it was that there were these separation of powers.
Yes. And the ballot theft scandal, big uproar
Yeah,
statewide.
talk.
That was over the issue of the voting results for county sheriff. The campaign for sheriff had a number of candidates in it. It was kind of a mess. The current sheriff, Ralph Jennings, was anti-GGC, was a write-in candidate, but the outcome was in favor of this man named Gordon Skimmerhorn, who was a Banks fail ally and actually himself participated in the ballot theft. The idea of having the sheriff who can deputize people, allow them to carry arms under authority of law and arrest people, that was the dream for Banks and Fail.
It was a close call in that sheriff election. And so Jennings, the incumbent, who lost by just very slim margin, demanded a recount. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's been happening for so long and locally too. I thought that was so interesting. Just the whole idea of calling for a recount.
Yeah. So Skimmerhorn kind of cut his own throat by participating in the recount. And then it was soon learned that all these Good Government Congress officials were involved in the ballot theft from the courthouse.
So they broke into the courthouse and the vault where
Yes.
ballots were being held until the recount, and then they stole them and destroyed them. And it just seemed at that point, Banks and Fail had totally gone off the rails. I mean, they were really going rogue.
Yes, they were. It was a crazy, crazy thing to do. And it seems absolutely ludicrous. Comic opera kind of stuff. Tragic comic, if you will. But to have done such a thing really involves some desperate characters. And to the very end, Llewellyn Banks, after his arrest, he still firmly believed he was in the right, having shot the police officer who came to arrest him, shot him dead on his front porch.
And he was going to arrest him because he was being accused of participating in that ballot theft, right?
Yes, yes, they had finally been able to tie him with evidence to the ballot theft.
Wow,
So,
that's so interesting. I go up to Roxy and Peak quite often and am familiar with George Prescott Park. And I never knew who George Prescott was until I read your book and realized he was a police officer right here in Medford. And he was shot and killed by Llewellyn Banks after the theft of those ballots as they were attempting to arrest Banks at his house.
and his quite large, commodious house there on the corner of West Main and Peach Street
Is it still there?
Medford is still there. It's been substantially modified, but it's still quite recognizable. You know, that somewhat palatial looking home was part of the appeal of Llewellyn Banks to so many people. He was denouncing the rich, the plutocrats that had been running things under Hoover, but he himself benefited locally from this image of wealth and power that he carried with him when he moved up from California.
Wow, that all sounds so familiar too.
Drove a Cadillac, actually had two of them, dressed in very fine suits.
So, populist leadership, as we're talking about, often sells itself as fighting corruption, but sometimes they become the corruptors. What warning signs should communities watch for when reform movements begin behaving like the corrupt actors they once opposed?
Investigative journalism is really an important aspect, and that's lessening in availability and amount these days. And even when those allegedly corrupt actors castigate journalists as liars and as fake news, as is being done today, relentlessly by people like Donald Trump, it takes a certain kind of steadfastness on the part of journalists and journalistic enterprises, newspapers, networks. I sometimes wonder if we still have that steadfastness and that spine. The social fabric and the political well-being has been so corroded by many different aspects, from the postmodern distrust of science and expertise. Today everyone's got their own opinion, don't need facts, don't need science. My opinion is just as right as anybody else's because I believe it. And there you have it, right? Belief over facts, belief over rationality. And that seems to be where we're at in this country today. So I have real concerns that this country has, I sure hope it does, but whether it has the strength of bonds between quite often opposing people to try and save what is best for the good of all.
As a historian, you work extensively with the Southern Oregon Historical Society and their records. How essential is that public memory in combating government corruption, especially when modern actors might erase or rewrite inconvenient histories?
Oh, it's crucial. Dusty old archives are worth all their weight and all the dollars to maintain them and make them open to the public. A lot of my research was done in the Jackson County archives. I didn't have to pay money to go look. I just went there and studied and paid for photocopying. I did a lot of photocopying of all these incredible criminal investigatory files of the state police and the Jackson County District Attorney's Office during the various trials that were held of GGC defendants, including Banks and Fell and others, a number of whom were sentenced to the Oregon State Penitentiary. Banks died in the state pen, actually in the state insane asylum, but he was still a prisoner, a convict, as part of the state penitentiary. Now, Earl
Okay.
Fail also went to the state pen, and he had a much shorter sentence. Banks, for the murder, got a life sentence. Fail got, I think it was 4 years in the state penitentiary. And he returned immediately upon his release to try and restart this whole deal. He was just as crazy as Llewellyn Banks was.
Right. And didn't he end up at an insane asylum?
Fail was later found legally insane. That's true. And
So they
at the
both were.
yes, they both was quite the scene in Jackson County then. The feelings were just fever hot. It was like a keg of gunpowder in the streets of Medford that were ready to explode. The digital exhibit that was put together by myself and two other people, Anna Sloan and Jan Wright at the Southern Oregon Historical Society, includes newsreel footage of some of the activities of the Good Government Congress, especially one of the rallies on the courthouse steps late in the period before things finally totally blew up in March of 1933. It was a big crowd and all the gesticulating by Earl Fell and Llewellyn Banks up on top of the courthouse steps and a big crowd out on the lawn. It was quite an event.
Got a sneak preview of your digital exhibit, and like the book, it has fascinating photographs from that time period. And, being from this area, it's really interesting to see what the area looked like and who were the leaders during that period.
It was funded by the Oregon State Capitol Association, which is a nonprofit group that has both three-dimensional exhibits down in the lower floor beneath the rotunda of the Capitol. And there's going to be one on the Jackson County Rebellion. But this
Oh,
digital exhibit is a foretaste of that. The actual three-dimensional exhibit will have artifacts for 6 months or 9 months.
so how can people access your digital exhibit ahead of
Well,
time?
it will be made public by the Southern Oregon Historical Society through their website.
So people can go to sohs.org and find your digital exhibit on the Historical Society's website.
Yes.
Okay. This is all just so interesting. And again, I see so many parallels between what happened right here in the Rogue Valley with what is happening at the federal level. What else would you like people to know about that period in our Rogue Valley history and what it says about today?
I want to give a shout out to people like Robert Rule and other writers for the Mail Tribune and other newspapers in Oregon that commented on this episode as it was unfolding.
Yeah. As a former garden columnist for the Mail Tribune, I was always very interested in the fact that the newspaper had won a Pulitzer Prize. And I never knew why until I read your book, Jeff.
When I first moved here, that's what got me interested in this topic. There was a thing, the masthead on the Tribune used to say a Pulitzer paper or something like that, and so what the heck is this about? And I began inquiring and starting to learn bits and pieces and went from there.
Well, I hope our local newspapers continue to make it because we certainly need independent journalists to tell us what's going on. And as we saw in the case of the Jackson County Rebellion, having more than one newspaper is also a good idea because you can't count on just the one newspaper to tell you the whole story. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, and thank you for writing the book.
Thanks for that, Rhonda, and thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Jeff reminds us that corruption doesn't just happen somewhere else, whether it's the Rogue Valley in the 1930s or Washington, D.C. in 2025. The mechanics of authoritarian corruption are the same. Power consolidates, oversight weakens, and loyalty gets rewarded over merit and integrity. Anne Applebaum's Autocracy, Inc. shows us the global version. Jeff LaLande's The Jackson County Rebellion shows us the local one. Together, they prove that corruption is not just history or headlines. It's a living threat, one that adapts and resurfaces whenever we let our guard down. Fellow Oregonians, here's the truth. Democracy doesn't implode in one dramatic moment. It gets chipped away while we're busy pointing fingers and calling names. Authoritarian corruption loves that kind of distraction. But history proves it doesn't have to win. In the Rogue Valley, regular folks stood up, got loud, and demanded their democracy back. Now it's our turn, this time on a national scale. Either we break the cycle, or we get to live through another sequel, one that nobody asked for. Resistance is exactly what I came across when I talked with some folks at the recent Families First rally in Ashland for another segment of Rogue on the Road. So first of all, tell me your names.
My name is Dickie Wilson.
Dickie. And what's your name?
Janet Owen.
Janet. And what's your name?
Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Janet. Hi, Dickie. So tell me, ladies, why are you out here today?
We just want to keep the protest up, the resistance up. We have to push back against this incredibly fascist, corrupt, insane administration. It's just so horrible. So whatever we can do, we have to do something. I belong to Indivisible too. I think we all do, and it's a really good vehicle for making something happen, and thank God for that.
Yeah. And what is it about the Trump administration specifically that you're upset about?
Well, they're destroying the country. They're taking every institution and ripping it to shreds. He's corrupt. He lies every time he opens his mouth. He's ruined our reputation in the world. He's making these bills go through that will give money to the billionaires and take money from Medicaid and people in the SNAP program, things that people need. I call Cliff Bentz every day. I just have to say and do something because, I mean, he's destroying our country.
Janet, what about you?
I just want to show that we're not just sitting back and taking it. We're out there.
Yeah.
All over the country.
Thank you. And what about you?
I can only echo what these ladies have already said. He's an embarrassment You can't travel anywhere in the world without people saying, what's going on over there? He's destroying democracy. He's ruining our entire philosophy in this country about helping and welcoming. And
There's a lot to pick from, huh?
there's a long list. I don't have enough time.
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
And I don't think you have enough film.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Hi there. Tell me what your name is.
My name is Richard LaLande.
So, why are you out here today?
Well, this is just, what we're doing today, demonstrating that is just one aspect of the damage that Trump and his cohorts are doing to the country. And it's heartbreaking to see them tearing down everything that I think has been best about this country my whole life.
Give me some examples.
Well, that we are here to help each other, to take care of each other, to embody honesty and integrity and dignity in public office and in private.
Yeah.
And to see these people tearing all that down, not respecting any of that, and actually to take glee, apparent glee in the cruelty with which they are treating people without any regard for anyone but themselves and their billionaire friends. It's just like, how did we come to this?
Right. So, how do you feel coming out here with your signs is helpful?
I have no idea whether or not it's helpful. It's like I sign petitions and letters online, 30 or 40 of them every day. I have done since, almost a year now.
Wow.
And people ask me, well, what good does that do? Who pays attention to those? I said, I have no idea what good it does, but it makes a difference to me. I feel like it is a way that I can remind myself what's important, and that you never know what effect any of your actions or statements is ever going to have. And most of it will be ignored or forgotten or never paid attention to, but one thing once might hit the right person the right way, and they're in a position to actually do something very substantive. And you never know.
Right. If there was one thing that you could tell our state legislators, what would it be?
Wake up, do your job, stand up for us.
Wonderful. Richard, thank you. Okay, tell me your name.
My name's Michelle.
Hi, Michelle. So tell me what it is that it upsets you the most about the Trump administration. I can see that you're upset about the immigrant policies.
Correct. I think that it's difficult to pin down a most, considering we have such high need issues right now, very concerning issues. But I would say number one is the treatment of immigrants in this country. They're the backbone of our country. They deserve to be treated as human beings. We have a Bill of Rights for a reason, and that pertains to every person on U.S. soil, not just U.S. citizens or who Donald Trump deems worthy of citizenship. So right now, immigrants are my top priority, making sure that they are safe, taken care of, uncaged, fed, basic human rights.
Tell me why you're out here today.
To show my daughters that it's our civic duty as Americans to use the rights that many take for granted, and we can see the perils of taking them for granted going on right now. We have a First Amendment right to assembly and to protest, and we need to use that to fight back against oppressive policies that do not benefit anyone but the uber rich.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what do you think about your mom out here doing all this?
I think my mom's really brave to be doing this because most people don't like to go out into protests because they're scared somebody's not going to agree with them. That's not really what matters. Protests are to show people what you believe.
Thank you for being out here. Thank you all. Every act of resistance is another strike against that six-armed monster of authoritarian corruption, and another step toward keeping democracy off its dinner plate. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rogue Resistance. There are 4 ways you can help us build this all-volunteer effort. Subscribe and tune in to every episode. Like us, post a comment, and share the link on your social media. So until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay indivisible.